pizza, tomato, cheese, these basils. The reason why I talk about pizza in this Columbian exchange is because without this exchange of goods and various products, the fruitation of pizza would never have occurred in Europe, and we would never have all these great varieties of pizza available in various countries around the world, whether it be Korea, United States, Japan, or Singapore. Now, in this global transfer, it was just not foods, but it was also animals, plants, and unfortunately a lot of diseases that made its way from Europe to America. The exchange was made by ships, traveled from the Americas to Europe and vice versa. So let's start by focusing what went from the Americas to the Europe, or what other people would say, the New World to the Old World. So we start with perhaps one of the most important items, potatoes. So potatoes are just an awesome product because they are inexpensive. You can grow a lot of potatoes at once. They have enough nutrients, and eventually it became a staple crop for places like Ireland, and it really revolutionized agriculture and the way people ate in places like China. Now, sugar also made its way to Europe through the Columbian exchange, and this is a very interesting product because it had also a lot of side effects. This is the effect of the labor intensiveness of sugar meant more slaves necessary, and it really made the transatlantic slave trade even worse because the European nations that had sugar plantations heavily utilized slave labor in order to make sugar. So the Europeans did have a little bit of access to what was known as sweet salt or sugar to them back in the days of the Crusades, but never really made it in mass until the 1700s when the Europeans began to figure out sugar is this awesome product that you can use to make jam, you can use it in coffee, you can create chocolate with it, and it became a super popular commodity in the 18th century. In the 21st century, we still consume sugar at mass. Unfortunately, most of us consume too much sugar, and what's interesting is most people consume sugar, at least in the United States of America, through drinks. So this is a nice, interesting chart here that shows you just how much sugar is in each one of these drinks. So you even have something like vitamin water, which I would have to say is probably one of the most grotesquely deceptive advertised products, right? Because they have the word water in their drink. Yeah, it's 125 calories. But anyways, it shows that most Americans, especially teenagers, consume sugar through sugary drinks and beverages. So continuing with this talk about sugar, the average teen in the United States today consumes about 84 grams of sugar. So to give you an idea how much that is, a can of Coke has about 11 grams of sugar. So we're talking about almost 8 cans of Coke a day. So most people are having too much sugar. As you can see from this chart above too, that going back to the soft drinks, for teenagers it seems like soft drinks is where a lot of this sugar intake is coming from. Now moving on to tomatoes or whatever you want to call it. So this was consumed by the Aztecs through salsa, chili, and first when it came to Europe, Europeans actually thought they were poisonous and didn't really touch them all the way until the 19th century. And then once people realized, oh, you can consume them, it became very popular, especially in places like Italy. All right, moving on to coffee. So coffee is one of those products that definitely would never have made it to Europe because you need to grow it in tropical climates, and Europe is definitely not tropical. And originally it was actually a medicinal drink, so people drank coffee to calm themselves down. It was also used as an enema, and today people consume coffee all around the world, and actually Americans consume the most coffee more than any other nation. What also makes coffee an incredibly important commodity worldwide is just how many people are involved with the making of coffee. So whether it's those who are farming for coffee, those who trade coffee, obviously those who sell coffee, when you add them all up, we're talking about 20 million plus people are involved with the production of coffee worldwide in the world we live in today. Moving on to corn, originally called maize by natives, corn is a very important commodity today for a very interesting reason, and that is that corn is not a super important food for humans, but corn is a very, 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 very important food for animals. When we look at our animals, especially in North America, whether it be chickens, cattle, sheep, all these animals eat corn, and it's become a major staple for various farmers who have these type of animals at the farms. Now let's shift gears and look at what went from Europe to the Americas, or as people back then would have said, from the old world to the new world. So we start off with apples. They started off in Turkey and were eventually brought to Europe, and then obviously all the way to the Americas through the Columbian exchange. They're rich in antioxidants, they have great fiber, and they were a great hit immediately upon reaching the Americas. So horses were a major game changer in regards to what went from the old world to the new world, or from Europe to the Americas. And the biggest reason why was what horses can do in regards to transportation. Right? Horses can carry a lot of weight, whereas until then, The main animal that was used for transport was the llama, and llamas are very, very weak creatures. In fact, they can only hold up about 100 pounds, which in fact is less than what some human beings can carry. So back in the prior to the Columbian exchange, if you wanted to move goods from point A to point B in the Americas, it was actually more efficient to use humans than to use animals. Not only are horses awesome to carry a lot of weight, but we can connect carriages to the back of them with wheels and ride. We can also directly ride the horses by putting saddles on them. So they totally changed the way transportation was happening in the Americas upon arrival. Now, pigs were also a major game changer, and this is because of the breeding pigs have. So pigs can, in fact, breed at a rate of over 15 pigs per male and female pig a year. That's a 7.5 times increase. So in a matter of years, you can imagine if you bring over 40, 50 pigs, you can right away go up to the hundreds, and then not too long afterwards, thousands. So pigs can reproduce at this great rate, and you can eat them for food. Now, cows would go on to change farming forever in the Americas. Cows create milk. Cows are very easy to domesticate and control. They eat hay that can just be found in various places, right? So you don't have to worry too much about food. And finally, if you don't have enough food, you have a bad season for crops, you can eat the cows. So they are sort of the ultimate animal when it comes to farming. Sheep, like cows, are easy to feed, right? They just mostly eat grass. They're also very easy to control. They're great for clothing, right? They create a lot of wool, and kind of like cows too, if you don't want to eat them but you have a bad season farming for other types of things, you can always eat sheep meat for food. So bananas, like apples, were a huge hit in the Americas. They're not only healthy, but they also have great amounts of things like potassium, which is unique to bananas, and this healthy and great tasting food would go on to be a huge hit in the Americas. So moving on now to diseases. So unfortunately, a lot of diseases also made its way from the old world to the new world. These included malaria, smallpox, measles, and again, the estimates are very rough because we don't have the exact statistics, but we know that through this exchange, disease traveled and many, many Native Americans died. Some estimates say even more than 90% of the local population ended up passing because of these various diseases that were transmitted from the Europeans to the Native Americans. Alright, so that's it with the Columbian Exchange. We're going to shift gears now, talk a little bit about the economy as we finish up this section. So capitalism is on the rise now as states begin to have less ownership, and the concept of private ownership begins to rise. This concept of investments begins to take control over the market. So this concept of capitalism was first popularized through the writings of Adam Smith and The Wealth of the Nations. Now, even prior to Smith, though, the concept of investments and private property existed. So if we see probably the earliest form of people investing, well, this comes in the form of joint stock companies. So there are these various expeditions taking places from European states, and they're going to these new parts of the different parts of the world, whether it be Asia or America, in order to find new resources, new natural resources. And the way it worked is that investors would buy stocks of the company, and if the trips were successful, they would gain the fruits of those benefits. The discovery of Jamestown would be a good example of a successful joint stock company expedition. Now keep in mind that these were high risk, high return investments, as in you can invest tons of money into a specific joint stock company, but if their expedition goes on and they fail or their ship sinks, in that case all your investments are gone. So this is a little bit different from what we see in investments today. So most investments today, just done by the average layman, is done in the format of public stocks. So most of the big companies you see around the world would be Nike, Apple, Facebook, United Airlines. All these companies are publicly traded. What that means is that people can come from the public and buy stocks, buy part of the company, and own a share. Now, if a company is doing well, the share of the stock goes up in price, and people have the choice to either continue to retain that piece of the property, piece of the ownership of that company, or they can go on to sell it. And that's what some people do as a full-time business, right? They buy part of a company, they buy the stock, and they sell at a higher price. Now keep in mind, not all companies are public, whether it's Emirates Airlines, Korean Air, PricewaterhouseCoopers, this company that makes Mars bars, M&Ms, Twix, Snickers. These companies all have something in common. They're privately owned, which means people from the outside do not have the ability to buy their stocks. And this comes with an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is they don't have any stockholders to convince, right? People from the outside can't really convince them to say, do this, not that. They have a lot more individuality and sort of authority over their own decisions. At the same time, the disadvantage of not being public is just simply the amount of money you have. Right? If you look at the massive amounts of money these public companies get from stocks, it helps our businesses run, whereas companies like PwC and Emirates are relying on their own funders, their private funders. So during this period, a theory emerges known as mercantilism, is where countries' powers depend on their wealth, right? Not their military, not their population's well-being, but the amount of money they are able to create. And that begs the question then, what creates a rich nation? According to mercantilism, the idea is to have favorable trade balance, as in you should be selling more goods than you are buying. Right? You should be selling more than you're buying. And it worked well in colonialism because it provided these European states with justification and motivation to extract as many resources as possible from the newly conquered lands. Now, obviously, much time has passed since the times of colonialism, and this concept of mercantilism is not quite the same, right? As anyone knows who takes a basic economics class, there's a lot more to do with the economy than just simply what you're selling and what you're buying from other countries, right? There's inflation, there's deflation, there's taxes of various types, there's tariffs to deal with, there's production, there's aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and so on. It's a very complex process. So does this process exist today of just simply emphasizing to sell more than you buy? Well, actually it still does to a certain degree. And how does this exist? Well, it exists in the form of tariffs. So this is where countries set specific taxes on specific items in order to protect their domestic industry. So United States, for example, the auto industry, whether it's be Ford or Chrysler, these companies are protected by the US government by having extra taxes every time a German car comes, a Japanese car comes, a Korean car comes into the United States. People have to pay an extra premium to own it. And the same goes for, let's say, Korea with rice. So you can get cheap rice from various places in Southeast Asia, and Japan has the same deal where Japanese farmers and Korean farmers are protected by their government by having the government force people to buy Korean-made rice or Japanese rice at a much higher rate. In fact, often 4 or 5 times more than they would pay for rice coming from Southeast Asia. Now, a good question to consider is this idea of tariffs good or bad? Well, it's a concept with definitely a positive and a negative. So on a positive side, it does protect domestic industry. Right? You don't want to be simply importing everything, especially food, because then the question comes, what if those countries stop selling you food? Then you have no more food left. At the same time, though, it definitely does damage the consumer. It is a logical question to ask, well, should consumers in Japan be paying 5 times the amount of rice, for rice, in comparison to if they would just get imports from the Philippines? Similar note, this concept of capitalism is also one with strong advantages and disadvantages. So the disadvantages of capitalism is that it often creates the dangers of monopolies and oligopolies. So a good example are the airlines. When we look at airlines in various countries, you only see 2 or 3 major airlines, and this is because they are oligopolies. We also see major wealth inequality. A good example is the United States of America, the most millionaires in the world, yet you have something like 20% of children in the United States go asleep every night hungry. And finally, boom and busts. The common pattern any capitalistic society faces is that there are rises and drops throughout time. Now, the benefits of a capitalistic society is efficiency, right? When you have competition, at least in theory, the better and more efficient companies win. So if there's 4 companies that are selling chocolate, eventually the ones that are selling it for the cheapest and the highest quality are the ones to survive, and the companies that are not working well, because they're corrupt or their workers are lazy, will eventually go away. The other big advantage is economic freedom. So you don't have the government saying, oh, well, this company is necessary, so we're going to charge 300% taxes for every time we have mangoes coming into our company because we want to protect this mango company domestically. And finally, the biggest strength is probably economic growth. If we look throughout the world, various places, especially, for example, East Germany and West Germany throughout the 80s and to a certain degree the 70s, we see that countries generally that have economic and political freedom have a much higher rate of economic growth than those that do not. We saw during this period also a beginning of what's known as inflation, a continual increase in the price of goods. So inflation normally happens, and it still happens today in our society, something like 3 to 5% a year. Right? That's why if you look at prices of items 20 years ago to today, they're more expensive. You talk to your parents, how much did they pay for a can of Coke? It's obviously very different than what you'd pay for a can of Coke today. Now, what's interesting is this concept of hyperinflation. This is when an increase in price by over 50% a month. So if something is, let's say, $1, and a month passes and it's selling for $1.50, another month passes, it's selling for $2.25. Right? So in a matter of 2 months, it's gone from $1 to more than $2. So this is an example of hyperinflation. And in recent years, we've seen in Germany in the 1920s, and in Zimbabwe, we saw probably the greatest hyperinflation we've ever seen in history. So what happened in Zimbabwe was, as the economy began to fall, they had the not so brilliant idea of simply printing more money. And by printing more money, they thought they'd have more money. But that's not the way the economy works. When you print more money, what happens is everything just becomes more expensive, and the value of your goods drop. And in fact, in the very, very latter years in Zimbabwe, you actually had things like the $1 billion bill, the $100 billion bill. Right? They just simply had more paper. And it wasn't like the value of money was going up. They were just printing it more. So we end on a final note of globalization. So we live in a truly globalized era. Right? We have items from various parts of the globe. We import various goods, whether it's just the meal you just ate today or yesterday. I almost guarantee that not all the food was grown locally, or not even locally, but within your own country you live in. So we live in an era of globalization, which definitely has its benefits, but also its demerits, but that's for a whole nother lesson in economics. So for now, that is section 4. Apologies for it being a rather long video. Copyright disclaimer under section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Have an excellent day. Goodbye.